Hello, everybody. My name's Ruth Kinna, and this is a session to introduce the Great Anarchist series, published by Dog Section Press. There's a copy of the first one there. And the session really marks the publication of the pamphlets, the 10 original pamphlets appearing as a book. As I said, the pamphlets and the book have been published by Dog Section Press, and both are illustrated with beautiful drawings by Clifford Harper. So I thought what I'd do is say something about the genesis of the project, so how it came about, something about the selection of the thinkers that are, or the writers that are included in the series, and then say something about the aims of the series, what it was that we were trying to do, or are trying to do. And then I want to do a short reading just to give you a flavour, if you've not looked at any of the pamphlets, from the second pamphlet, which is looks at the work of Voltaire de Cleyre. And then hopefully there'll be time for questions and some discussion. So if I start with the idea, how the idea came about, I don't want to take any credit for it at all. The initiative was suggested or started by Dog Section Press. And I immediately warmed to it. I was just delighted to be involved in it, because one of the starting points, I suppose, of the project was to celebrate anarchist histories, and celebrate anarchist histories as a valuable resource. So specifically to think about how the histories of past thinkers, the ideas of past thinkers, still resonate in contemporary politics, and to address what I suppose I thought at least was the tendency to sideline anarchist history, to think of it as something that was dead and buried and not very useful. So the principle behind the series was to show how past writers can help us think about our current politics, what the traditions of anarchism are, how we can trace our specific ways of thinking about socialism and anti-capitalism and domination, and how anarchist ideas have changed over time, how they can still be integrated into a live tradition, how ideas can be used and adapted and extended. So for those of you who aren't familiar, there's an opening blurb to all of the pamphlets, which sets out these aims. So it says the short introductions delve into the anarchist canon to recover some of the distinctive ideas that historical anarchists have advanced to address problems relevant to their circumstances. Although these contexts were special, many of the issues that anarchists wrestled with still plague our lives. Anarchists developed a body of writing about power, domination, injustice and exploitation, education, prisons, and a lot more besides. Honing in on different facets of the anarchist canon is not just an interesting archaeological exercise. The persistence, development, and adaptation of anarchist traditions depends on our surveying the historical landscape of ideas and drawing on the resources it contains. So this is a theoretical toolbox, and albeit a small assortment of anarchists, which should be used to help us and as I say, amend and adapt our ideas. So that was what the pamphlet series was supposed to be doing. That's what the book now collects together as a specific aim. And I want to talk now about the selection, because there's been some I've had some questions about the selection, why it was that we chose the people that we did. And the selection was made largely around the drawings that Clifford Harper had produced. So the drawings were pre-existing, and Clifford Harper very kindly agreed to allow us to use a selection of the drawings that he'd made. But it was a limited list that we had to start off with, and we didn't choose all. We knew we were going to write 10. So I think we were offered 12 or 14 originally. I think Shelley was on the list and didn't get a pamphlet. Winstanley was also on the list, also didn't get a pamphlet. And we decided what we'd do was take some of the best known anarchist thinkers of the 19th century, so people like Peter Kropotkin, Michael Bakunin, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Errico Malatesta. We included all of the women who were on that original list, so Louise Michel, Voltaire de Cleyre, and Lucy Parsons. And then Stirner and Godwin made the final cut on the grounds that they were important thinkers for 19th century anarchists. So they have a place in the tradition, however controversial they may be. And Oscar Wilde, also controversially included in the series, controversial because he didn't call himself an anarchist particularly, but he was certainly aligned with people in the anarchist movement in his own lifetime, and spoke fondly, warmly of anarchists, particularly of Kropotkin. But he's included in the list really as a fellow traveller rather than as a self-identifying anarchist. But in my view, it's this sort of the intersections that exist between different sets of ideas, between traditions of ideas across socialism. For me, these are important. And my view is that anarchism should be outward looking and comprehensive. And so, I would defend Wilde's inclusion in the list of great anarchists. So we are hoping to produce a second series, which includes a lot of people who are extremely well known and well loved in the anarchist movement, but who weren't available to us the first time round. And we're in discussion about doing that now. So hopefully that will start sometime in the near future. So if I move on to say something a bit more about the aims of the series, the pamphlets are, they include, they all begin with a short introduction to the thinker under review or under consideration, and I try and provide some context to the lives of the people that I'm discussing, and I try and draw attention to the reputations that they gained during their own lifetime and the reputations that they've since acquired. So I'm not trying to give a comprehensive account of the individuals, but are still not trying to conceal any of the less attractive features of some of the anarchists that we talk about. So I mentioned Proudhon's anti-Semitism, Bakunin's anti-Semitism, Proudhon's anti-feminism, and so forth. So this isn't an attempt to be uncritical, but the principal aim, I suppose, of the series, of the pamphlets, is to hone in on a particular theme that for me anyway stands out in the huge body of work that these people produced. So each pamphlet looks at one or two key ideas or themes, I guess. So when it comes to Bakunin, I look at political theology. Malatesta, I look at propaganda. Louise Michel, I look at education. Oscar Wilde, I look at democracy. And these are not necessarily the most obvious themes that you would associate with these thinkers. So when I talk about Kropotkin, I don't talk about mutual aid very much. I talk about free agreement. When I talk about Proudhon, I look at his understanding of progress and justice rather than the concept of property as theft. So in doing that, I'm not trying to be obtuse, but what I want to do is to try and highlight things that might have got lost, if you like. So some of the ideas that we tend not to think about, rather than the ones that we always think about, and certainly mutual aid, I think, is high on the list. I also want to think about, or to look at ideas that I think might have become misconstrued, and I think that's certainly the case with concepts of progress in anarchism or theories of social evolution. So for me, to come back to what I was saying at the outset about historical traditions and the value of looking at the past, I think in recent years there's been a tendency to try and or to misunderstand actually what 19th century anarchists were doing, and I think that misunderstanding is particularly clear in the concept of classical anarchism. So we now have this notion of what a classical anarchist believed, what the ideology of classical anarchism was, and it's often presented, I think, as a rather rigid kind of ideological position, and also sometimes a naive expression of Enlightenment thinking. So anarchists are put in the same box as liberals and indeed with some Marxists who were deterministic, who believed in the the necessity of progress, who had a naive understanding of human nature. And one of the things I want to do in selecting the themes that I look at is expose some of these prevalent ideas or misperceptions, as far as I'm concerned, to explode them as myths. So that's what I'm trying to do. So what I want to do now, just to round up the presentation, and before I open to questions, and I hope we can have a discussion. I'd be really interested in having a discussion. I want to give you a sample of the pamphlets by looking at a couple of selections from the second one, which is on Voltairine de Cleyre. And Voltairine de Cleyre, for those of you who are not familiar with her, she was a contemporary of Emma Goldman, and she was networked in some of the same circles as Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman and Voltairine de Cleyre didn't particularly get on, although they did defend each other. And Emma Goldman wrote a very interesting appreciation of Voltairine de Cleyre after she died. Voltairine de Cleyre was more closely associated with Alexander Berkman, who edited her work and published it posthumously. She was an incredible, she was a poetess, she was a writer, she was an educator. She spent a lot of her activist career in Philadelphia. She was an incredible pro-feminist anarchist. She's sometimes associated with what's called individualist anarchism, but became an advocate of anarchism without adjectives. So someone who thought that rather than try and attach anarchism to any particular set of revolutionary principles, that actually anarchism was about enabling people to make their own determinations of how life should be lived, and not saddle them with any particular set of ideas. So the selections I'm going to read are about her analysis of sexual domination, so patriarchy, if you like, and of direct action. In the pamphlet, I also talk about her critique of colonization in respect of the Mexican Revolution. So she was an outstanding propagandist for the anarchists in the Mexican Revolution, and she talked at length about the appalling brutality of the colonizing regime as it unfolded in the early years of the 20th century. So one of the things that you'll notice in the text is the use of the word slavery. So Voltairine, this is one of Voltairine de Cleyre's own words. It's not my word. So when she talks about patriarchy, she talks about sex slavery. When she talks about direct action, she talks about overcoming enslavement. And she wasn't alone in thinking about slavery as a concept. So this is a very familiar term in 19th century anarchism, the notions of slavery and enslavement. And it's used to describe the systems of domination that anarchists argued constitutional regimes protected and sustained. So slavery is obviously a highly loaded term, and it's used in a metaphorical sense in a way, but it's used in a literal sense too. So for anarchists like Voltairine de Cleyre, the abolition of chattel slavery was actually best thought of as a transformation, not as an abolition. So what she argued was that free citizens, those who were no longer owned by masters, were nevertheless still dependent on those masters. So even if masters could no longer claim actual ownership of their bodies, they could still control their lives. So I'm going to start with an account of Voltairine's critique of sex slavery, and then read the section on direct action. And then I'm going to start looking at the questions, for which thank you very much. So Voltairine's analysis of sex slavery was rooted in an analysis of dependency. In this case, domination was explained by the dependence of men on women and the enslavement of women, seduced in one way or another by the arrangements that men made for their keep. Borrowing Proudhon's idea, she declared that women were property, slaves to men, just as workers were enslaved to owners. Unequal pay, marriage laws, unpaid domestic labour, the presumption of women's intellectual incapacity, paternity rights that granted ownership of children to fathers and awarded reproduction rights to husbands were some of the leading features of this regime. The duty to protect, sanctified by the church, provided the moral cover for this tyranny. It was suffocating, and it operated as much in women's minds as it did through the cosseting institutions men created. Voltaire's conclusion was that domination would survive the abandonment of those institutions for as long as the current behaviours were unaltered. In They Who Marry Do Ill, that's the title of an essay, Voltaire admitted that marriage law was generally repressive. However, the tough message of the essay was that slavery was reinforced by monogamy and cohabitation, not merely by state or church control of intimate relationships. Women stripped themselves of their capacity to meet their own basic needs independently of their menfolk by accepting the role of homemaker. This was not a call for abstinence, though Voltaire anticipated that the birth rate would fall once women released themselves from male domination. The collapse of close communion was a requirement for the constant innovation she associated with anarchy. Women had to live separately to be truly independent. Women's enslavement was not merely economic, not merely political, not merely social or sexual. It was tied up with the regulation of human affections. Where domination reigned, love was a conservative force. Even in the most affectionate relationships, partners would stifle their better judgments to appease spouses and preserve the mundane friendships that passion bred. Turning love back into an emancipatory power meant loosening families, organising collective responsibility for childcare, and fully recognising individual self-expression. So that's what she had to say, or that's my take on what she had to say about women's emancipation. On direct action, just a little section, and then I'll finish. I think this is really interesting, her account of direct action. Voltaire's call for direct action followed from her analysis of the bankruptcy of the Republic. Law and government could not function as independent arbiters of justice because they were dependent on the exploitative capitalist systems they regulated. Nor could existing systems be appropriated by the oppressed and redeployed for revolutionary purposes, no matter how lyrically conventional socialist philosophers waxed to the contrary. The only way individuals could combat slavery was to assert themselves as free beings by taking direct action. Direct action was a principle, not a tactic. The difference between suffrage campaigners and anarchists was that the former worked outside the framework of institutional politics for instrumental reasons. Anarchists were committed to direct action because they believed in acting for themselves. Direct action established their independence. This was Voltaire's theme in The Gates of Freedom. Direct action meant taking liberty, not waiting for deliverance, propagandizing by words and deeds, and by, quote, being what we teach. It had whatever content activists gave it, and it also meant asserting rights. For someone who disputed the benefits of the suffrage, this defense of rights seemed odd. Yet Voltaire had a particular conception in mind. Rights were not one-off permissions or entitlements granted by authority. They were temporary measures of justice, and their power derived from their general recognition. Rejecting the idea that there were any universal measures of right and wrong, justice and injustice, Voltaire nevertheless believed that it was possible to consider rights as mechanisms for social progression for as long as the demand challenged accepted practices and standards, so for as long as it contested domination. Demanding rights was inevitably disruptive. It compelled the enslaved to acknowledge their enslavement and expose the injustices of practices and behaviours that were generally believed to be natural, right, or fair. Progress, Voltaire argued, was marked by, quote, the transition from content to discontent, from satisfaction to pain, and from unconscious to conscious. Individual will and collective force both had a place in the process. Conflict was always likely because actions that directly threatened entrenched interests would create a backlash. Colonized should expect masters to deploy extraordinary force to quell their rebellions. Men would likewise be hurt, albeit in a different way, when women pressed their demands, though physical violence was common in this realm too, and it would take everyone time to adjust at every subsequent round of the struggle. Voltaire maintained a strong belief that there was a tipping point for every injustice and that oppressed peoples would eventually find a way to strike out against their oppression. This was what she argued in her final poem, which was called Written in Red, to our living dead in Mexico's struggle. The biblical myth of Daniel's warning to the tyrannous Belshazzar and the kingdom faced imminent destruction captured her thought that liberty would tackle domination. And this is a verse from the poem. Written in red, their protest stands for the gods of the world to see. On the dooming wall, their bodiless hands have blazoned a farcine, and flaring brands illume the message: seize the lands, open the prisons, and make men free. Okay, thank you. I'm going to take some questions. So the first one I've got: how did I become an anarchist, and which tendency do I hold personally, if any? So I came to anarchism through education. So I went to when I went to university. I suppose I thought of myself then as a socialist, but not aligned to any particular group. And when I went to university, I found that socialism pretty much meant one flavour or another of Marxism. That was the dominant thinking of the time. This was in the 70s, this was the late 70s. And in the process of the degree I did, which was history and politics, I discovered anarchism. So I did one course on the history of the Spanish Revolution, and that was my first introduction to this movement. And in my final year, I did a course with William Fishman, who was also anarchist, and it was a course on political thought. And that's when I first started reading. That's when I first discovered that there were these writers, Kropotkin, Bakunin, and the rest of them. And I never looked back. Once I'd started reading it, I never wanted to stop. So that's how I got into it. In terms of tendency, I think I'm pretty ecumenical, actually. I mean, I buy into the argument that Kropotkin makes for communism, which is that, you know, for as long as you allow any risk of accumulation, then you don't have security against the rise of statist institutions. So in that kind of abstract sense, I think that's probably true. In a more practical sense, I think I probably stand with Voltaire and declare that this is a matter of putting aside the adjectives and thinking about the systems of domination that confront you. The next question: what is the contribution? What is the contribution of individuals from great anarchists to modern anarchism? So what can we learn from? I think so. I understand that as what can we learn from the history. So I think one of the things that we can learn from the history is that anarchists have a well-defined and rich and plural social and political theory. So one of the things that I think is wrong, and it's sometimes said, is that anarchism is Marxism with a different attitude. So anarchists pretty much accept Marxist analysis of capitalism. They just don't like the idea of the vanguard party. They don't like Leninism. They don't like they disagree with the sort of the organization of political parties, and so it's a matter of a different practice, if you like, on the body of a common theory. And my view is that that's not the case. And that one of the things that you find in anarchist history is the articulation not only of a critique of Marxism, but an alternative to it. So I think one of the things we can learn from the history is to see how those ideas, how those constructive ideas, those concepts, if you like, can be used by us today. So particularly things like, I mean, not just mutual aid, but concepts of free agreement, concepts of direct action. I mean, we do this all the time, but anarchist thought is really rich in this conceptual thought, and I think it just helps us in our politics. Do I consider anarchism to be, by definition, a socialist ideology? So I take that question to mean, do I think anarchists are socialists, rather than do I think that anarchism is an ideology? But maybe that was I'm not sure whether you meant that too. So yes, I think anarchists are socialists. I think they're anti-capitalists. I think that necessarily they have to be. I don't believe that you can be um, um, I don't believe that you can roll back the state and defend the market and be anarchist, because the market itself is a system of domination, and it's the market and the state are co-constituted as far as I'm concerned. So it doesn't make any sense to me to be an anarchist and not a socialist. Question: we live in a time where it seems that electoral politics is no longer a choice, but vital damage mitigation. Do you think the great anarchists would have voted, even begrudgingly? Um, I think it depends who you talk to. I mean, I think Proudhon. I mean, well, Proudhon did take part in institutional politics and then regretted it and decided that he would never do it again. Just trying to think. I mean, virtually all of the people that I talk about who were alive at the time where the suffrage was being debated as a possibility of emancipation rejected it. But I think it's a different question about voting, or a slightly different question about voting. The argument that was being raised in the 19th century was really about the extent to which the control of the state, gaining control of the state, be it through force or by um, electoral means, would provide a route to transformation. And the answer was no. I think the argument about voting extends from that. It's about how far you think uh, a government can resolve any of the problems that we face. And I think the anarchist answer to that is no, they can't. It's, you know, it's only us who can do that through our collective organization. The practical pressure that exists from time to time when people are faced with electoral choices, or of not taking part in an electoral choice that seems to be significant, I think that's for individuals to decide. Would I say that some of these early anarchist communist theorists are largely rooted in Christian morality, especially in regards to justice? That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure. That's a really interesting question. So I think, I mean, clearly the anarchists are critics of Christian morality. So they don't accept, I'm just trying to generally, typically, they don't accept that it's possible to determine what is right and wrong independently of a context or of an independent judgment. So you can't forever say that this is moral, this is immoral, and that we can refer to any kind of authority to make that decision for us, or to make that call. So in that sense, they're clearly not bound by Christian morality. I think in a more diffuse sense, it would be difficult to argue that the anarchist tradition, or the Western European anarchist tradition, is not in some way shaped by Christian morality, even if the response is a critique. So when people like Bakunin talk about political theology, they clearly have a particular kind of theology in mind. And although Bakunin talks also about non-Christian theology, it's Christian theology and Christian morality that's uppermost in his mind. So that, you know, they're clearly immersed in some sense in Christian morality, but as critics of it, and as critics of the way in which Christian morality is secularized by liberals and Republicans to justify state discipline and authority. I really like written. Oh, thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad you liked the presentation. I really love written in red. Yes, I like written in red. I think it's fantastic. Can you please review the main ideas of the pamphlets? Kropotkin Free Agreement, Bakunin Anti-Theologism. Also, can you briefly summarize Proudhon's idea of justice of progress? Well, that's tough. So let me think. So the reason I looked at Kropotkin Free Agreement is because I wanted to explore a kind of another facet of what it means to to have a society that's based on a principle of mutual aid. And I think we kind of get used to the idea that there's an ethic and there's a sense or a principle of cooperation. And I think that does a huge amount of, I think it's hugely valuable, and I think it does a huge amount of work in terms of thinking about organization and um, solidarity and all of those practices. But there's another argument or another string in the anarchist bow, if you like, which is, if you want to contest the theory that underpins the state, the justification of the state, which is largely the idea of contract. So we have the state, apparently, according to mainstream political theory, because we have consented to authority, because we can't organize our affairs for ourselves, at least not conveniently or peaceably. So, as I say, mutual aid is a kind of response to that. It says, well, we don't need to give this consent to this third party, this authoritative um, institution, because we actually organise naturally from the grassroots up. But free agreement gives you a way of thinking about the tensions that exist within mutual aid. So mutual aid tends to think about cooperation as something that happens. And one of the things that Kropotkin says is that that's true, but it happens on the basis of being able to resolve conflicts. And if you have people being brought together in very fluid and dynamic relationships, which is one of the things that anarchy wants to imagine, then you have to think about the ways in which the consents, if you like, are made between individuals who might fundamentally disagree with each other. And free agreement is one of the concepts that helps us think about that. And I think if we don't think about that kind of problem, then we tend to put too much emphasis on the ethics, if you like, of mutual aid, even when we know that there are significant divisions within our own movements, let alone divisions between us and other movements. So anti-theologism, again, I think is a really rich idea, and it's an idea that comes from Bakunin's critique of theology, which he understands in a particular way. So Bakunin's argument is that all of the frameworks of political theory, everything that we've inherited from the past, apart from anarchist pasts, everything that we're taught, everything that we're told about the necessity of the state, the necessity of government, the necessity of following commands, of doing what the teacher says, whatever it happens to be. This follows from an idea of, fundamentally, it follows from an idea of human imperfection, which in Christian teaching is represented in the Bible as the idea of the fall. So the reason that we have to be disciplined in the earthly world is because Adam and Eve were corrupted. They fell from a divine status, and therefore they needed to be brought back onto the straight and narrow through their relationship with God, which in turn was mediated by those who felt that they had been anointed by God to undertake this task, to make us good. And Bakunin says, until we rid ourselves of this idea of imperfection, and that we must be perfected by some other means, by some other person, by some other enlightened, benevolent authority, until we rid ourselves of that, we could never really live anarchistically. So one of the things he does implicit in his critique of theology is to say, let's go back to the biblical story of the fall, and we can reread the expulsion from Eden as an escape. And actually, we can see that one of the things that Adam and Eve did, they made the first act of, they made the first sort of stance of liberation, because they decided they couldn't tolerate the tyranny of God laying down the rules and telling them what they could know and what they couldn't know. And so they left. They left under a cloud, admittedly, but this was the first anarchist act. It was an act of disobedience. And that's the first way that you acquire knowledge, a knowledge of yourself, and the first way in which you can start making meaningful human community on the basis of the fact that you're not imperfect and need to be perfected, but just on the basis of you are what you are. We have good and bad in all of us, and we have to make the best of the relationships that we find ourselves in. So I think political theology is then becomes the umbrella for all secular belief that says you have to have that authority to tell you what is right, to tell you what is wrong, to tell you how to behave, to tell you what the law is. And Bakunin says no, the anarchist act is to disobey and to reject all of that. Proudhon's idea of justice as progress, again, it's sort of tricky. I think Voltaire and Claire's understanding of direct action borrows very heavily, I think, from Proudhon's idea of justice as progress. So Proudhon's idea is that again, there's no ultimate standard of right or wrong, but there are standards that exist at any particular time in any particular culture or political location. So we have norms, we have moral outlooks, we make judgments, and the principle that Proudhon introduces, I suppose, is that those norms and those values and those judgments exist, or they're maintained by the balance of forces in society. But those forces are forever changing. And the problem that he has, or that he identifies in the state, is that what the state does is it tries to fix for all time a standard of moral practice or a set of norms that, if they were left to their own devices, would naturally change as people expressed their dissatisfaction with particular arrangements, as people thought about the world in different ways. And so what Proudhon says is that if you let social forces, which are complex and conflictual, if you let them find their own equilibrium, then actually what you'll find is that the standards of justice naturally change over time. So we can look back at the past and we can see that what we thought was right and fair actually was a way of dominating or making people unequal or oppressing people. We can see that in retrospect. And the way that you manage that kind of development, if you like, is to simply allow people to interact conflictually, but through resolution, through direct resolution of their own conflicts, in order to find new balances of justice for those temporary periods. And the process moves on and on and on. There's no absolute right or wrong in it. It's simply a dynamic process. I'm doing my MA in community music, focused on how we can use music to oppose the hostile environment, and want to do it through an anarchist lens, but have found resistance against this from university. Can you recommend any text to aid my case? I'm not sure that. There is a lot on music. Perhaps if you email me, and we can talk about this offline. I think that would be the easiest thing to do. So it would be interesting to know more about the project itself. The specifics of the project, rather than try and throw out texts. And I'm familiar with the resistance that universities put up to sort of innovative study, and I'm happy to try and help with that too. But I think it would be better if you could email me. So it's r.e.kinna, Kinna, at Loughborough, LBORO.ac.uk. Identity has become something of a mainstream point of political action in the past few decades, and it seems that the conversation has shifted away from working class politics. How do we find a balance between identity politics and the struggle against the boss class? I'm not sure that I'm not sure that I want to put identity against class in that sense. So one of the things I like about anarchist historical approaches to domination and this idea of enslavement is that you can see multiple forms of enslavement operating at the same time. So I don't think anarchists sort of pushed intersectionality in the 19th century as it's been presented to us now, through the work of multiple Black feminist writers in particular. But I think the seeds of intersectionality were always in anarchist thought. So the idea that class was not the only form of domination, the idea that there was something like patriarchy through sex slavery, the idea that there was colonization, the idea that there was, there were differential treatments of different groups of people, that the so-called neutral framework of liberal law played out against it for different groups of people in different ways. I think anarchists were alert to that. So I don't think we have to think about either identity or class. I think we can think about these things at the same time. And I think they work in different contexts. I think Bell Hooks says something similar to this too. These forms of oppression play out in different ways at different times with different intensities. And I think people, if you have to focus on what you can do rather than try and tackle everything all at once. And I think that the kinds of struggles that you get involved in must be, those judgments must be made by individuals and groups of people themselves. But I don't think identity plays off against class in that sense. I think that's a kind of a misleading framing of the problem, which kind of makes sense in some socialist thought, but I think anarchist has a more nuanced take on it. How can anarchists effect change today when there is so much authority which we cannot seemingly overturn? Well, that's a really good question too. So I think it's a matter of thinking about what you can do rather than thinking about the whole system that's against you. And I think there are always small things, really small things that you can do, depending on where you work, or if how you interact with people. You can be more or less tutorial with people, you can be more or less authoritative with people, you can be more or less subversive in the stuff you're told to do within your environments. There are things, you can organize your families differently, you can organize your social relationships differently. I think there are myriad things that you can do. You can do, you can join different groups, you can take part in different protests. So I don't think that it's helpful necessarily to think about how we get rid of something. I think it's a continual exercise in trying to anarchize things, and to find where those kinds of complexities lie, and how the more rigid, uniform, dull, routine things that we get sucked into, how we can upset those things through our relationships with other people, through our own actions. What you can choose to ignore, what you can choose to subvert. I think that's the way I think about it. But it's difficult. I agree, it's difficult. We will see more international anarchists in volume 2. If so, who are you interested in writing about? Will we see more? So, the series is partly limited by the drawings that exist, and it's partly limited by who I can comfortably write about. And it depends who you mean by international, I guess. So I'm hoping that there will be some different voices. In some cases, I think the difficulty I have, because I look primarily at text, I guess, is that if I don't have access to text, then it's much more difficult to be able to write about someone's approach to the world, or someone's contribution, if you like, to anarchism. There are some really, really important anarchists uh, whose contribution is primarily through their activity, comes through their activity, through their exemplary behaviours, through their amazing courage. But I'm not sure that that makes a pamphlet, or it doesn't make a pamphlet as easily for me. So I will do my best. I mean, I certainly want to demonstrate the scope that anarchism has, and it's not just a Western ideal. I think we should also, however, bear in mind that when we talk about Western anarchism, we are talking about a very plural body of thought, which was articulated by people who came from very different backgrounds and locations. So, I mean, there's considerable variation and international perspective even in the existing series. But I take the point that it is kind of narrowly focused on a more traditional canon, if you like, and it would be good to be able to break out of that. There was another part of that question, wasn't there? Who am I interested in writing about? One of the people I would like to write about is Rocker. I really like Rudolf Rocker, so I would like to write about him. I would also like to write. I have written recently about Emma Goldman in another context, and I would like to write about Emma Goldman. 10 minutes left now. Could you type in the email? Yes, I can. Do that. Right. There you go. That's the email. So if anybody wants to contact me, then please do. What differences do anarchism and libertarian Marxism have between each other? Oh, that's a really good question. I think it depends on which libertarian Marxists. I mean, I don't really want to make judgments, if you like, about what Marxism is, because I think Marxists should speak for themselves, and I come from a particular perspective, but I guess from the point of view of the anarchists that I engage with, the historical anarchists that I spend a lot of time speaking with, thinking about, Marxism is problematic for a number of reasons. One, because it prioritizes class over other forms of domination. Second, because of the theory of history, which seems to point towards a process of transformation that I think a lot of anarchists didn't accept. And thirdly, because Marxists advocated an approach to change that anarchists thought would reinscribe the state, or fail to address the problems of power that are linked to the state. So in other words, I think anarchists were always suspicious of the idea that we could think of the state as in some way a reflection of or shaped by economic forces. And anarchists argued persuasively, as far as I'm concerned, was that however you understood the relationship between particular systems of government and economic forces, so you could say that under capitalism, there was a shift towards bourgeois rule. The anarchists said, but that all happens within the context of the state. The state is a system of violence, it's a system of monopoly, it's a colonizing phenomenon, it's a centralizing sociological tool. So all of that has to be undone, and classlessness is not the silver bullet to resolve those problems. Now, I think that there are considerable overlaps between anarchists and libertarian Marxists, and there is there's room for dialogue, conversation, and certainly practical cooperation. But I think you know, for us, those fundamentals, if you like, from the anarchist perspective of Marxism, are the sticking points, or the boundary markers, I think, to understanding the divergence in the socialist tradition. And I think they're important. And that's that, you know, as I say, I don't think it's insurmountable, but I think they are the benchmarks, if you like, for an anarchist position. I think we've got 6 minutes left. I think we might have exhausted the questions now. So perhaps I can just say thank you to everybody for the questions. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking an interest in the series. Please do go out and you can check out the Dog Section Press site, because there's an awful lot more on there, which is really, really rich and really valuable. So have a look at the site, and you can read all of this, all of the pamphlets. I mean, pretty much all that Dog Section Press, or a lot of what Dog Section Press produce, is available for free online. You can also find copies, audio copies of the Great Anarchist series. If you Google it, it'll come up, I'm sure. Oh, last one. What am I currently reading? In terms of anarchism, what am I reading? The term has started, so I haven't been reading anything, actually. The things I've been reading recently are Rudolf Rocker's Nationalism and Culture. I've reread that and really enjoyed it, and have written something on anarchism and internationalism. And I've been reading Emma Goldman again. They're the two people I've been reading most recently. Who do you think would be an anarchist for our times? I think everybody should be an anarchist in our times. All good people are anarchists, is my view.